All right, today is Tuesday, March 18th, and I'm Sara Capen, and I'm at Murphy's Orchard with Carol Murphy, and she's going to tell us a little bit about the history of Murphy's Orchard, how she became involved with this farm, and how she became involved in the story of the farm with the Underground Railroad.
All right. I purchased this farm 36 years ago. When I purchased the farm, I was looking for a farm. I had absolutely no inkling of getting involved in a historic site. But when I came looking for the farm, both the realtor and the people that were selling the farm at that time told me that the people that had lived here in the 1800s, the McClew family, were involved in the Underground Railroad network. At that time, I was just as ignorant as most people in my generation about what the Underground Railroad was and the history of the Underground Railroad. However, it struck a very responsive chord with me, because when I was a child, when I was 4, 5, 6 years old, for some bizarre reason, we don't know why, but my father was appointed the military attaché to Israel in 1949. That is the year Israel became a state, and it was very volatile. But while my parents were out doing whatever it is that diplomats do, mostly drink and go to cocktail parties, I think. But while they were out doing that, my sister and I were pretty much raised by a couple that had just come out of a concentration camp in France. They were French and had just come out of a German concentration camp. In fact, everybody in Israel in 1949 had just come out of a concentration camp. And there were no children. None of the children had survived. So it was a very profound experience, and I don't remember any specific conversations. I don't remember anything anybody said to me specifically, but I know it put an indelible mark on my soul. And it's the same history. It's the same. I have a big club, and you don't. Not unlike your looks, so I'm going to beat you over the head with it. So when I heard about the Underground Railroad history here, it certainly, as I say, struck a responsive chord. So I started researching it, and it was extremely sporadic. The first thing I did was call the county historian and told him about what I had been told, and he said, well, you'll never find out anything because there's nothing written down and we don't have any records, so you're wasting your time and there isn't anything, which was pretty discouraging from a historian. But I took that to heart and didn't do much of anything for a long time. But along the way, meanwhile trying to operate a farm, I researched over at the Newfane Library and the Lockport Library and talked to people and picked up all sorts of pieces along the way. Now have 2 file cabinets full of information about the Underground Railroad, the McClews. The first thing I found out is that this farm has a history that's just remarkable for this area. It's just like a little living textbook of Niagara County history. They have found in I think it was the 1875, but I'm not sure, but I think it was the 1875 Newfane yearbook. They used to publish yearbooks just like high school yearbooks. They would have town yearbooks, and I think it was the 1875 yearbook that mentions that there are 2,000-year-old pre-pottery civilization Native American Indian remains on this farm. I have no idea where they might be. I've never tracked that down. I was also told when I purchased the farm that I was not supposed to plow up any untouched ground without a Native American medicine man in attendance, so there must be burial mounds here on the farm as well. I've never plowed up any untouched ground, so I've never gotten involved in that, although I'd very much like to track that history down. In addition to that, The McClews were here during the War of 1812. There were skirmishes fought on the McClew property. In that same history, this is also from, I believe, the Town of Newfane records, that James McClew was one of the original settlers to the Town of Newfane, arrived here in 1807, and most of the European settlers left the area during the War of 1812 and did not come back until after the war was over. James McClew is a total mystery to us. We have no idea who he is, except that he's certainly a McClew, but we don't have any idea if he is a direct ancestor of Charles McClew, who owned this property, or an uncle, but he was certainly a relative, and he was the first McClew that came here. So he came here in 1807, that's when the farm was first established. David McClew arrived here in 1826 when the Erie Canal opened. David brought his elder son Robert and walked the length of the Erie Canal from Albany area to Newfane, left his wife back in Albany with all the rest of the slew of children to fend for herself, and David and his son Robert came here and set up a homestead and a log cabin in the town of Newfane. The log cabins still exist. At the end of the north end of McClew Road, there is a little house that you would never take to be an old building, but it is the original McClew log cabin that has had like 1950 bondstone put over it, and it has no appearance of an older building, but that's what it is. David lived there on that property. He had, I think it was 9 children, Charles being one of them. And in 1850, Charles left his father's house, but moved to this location of his father's farm, built the house that exists here today, the barn, all the outbuildings, and simultaneously he and his bride, Anna Mariah, became involved in the Underground Railroad network. And I'll go back to that, but just to give you an overview of the history, their son Herbert inherited the farm in 1901. He was the induction officer during World War I, so anybody that was sworn into the service from the town of Newfane was sworn in my kitchen. Kitchen seems to play a pivotal role on this farm. And in 1945, with Herbert being the owner, they had a bumper crop of cherries in Niagara County. There were more sweet cherries than anybody had ever seen, and there was no one to harvest them because all the farm workers were over fighting a war. So they brought German prisoners of war onto this farm in 1945 to harvest the cherries. These were prisoners from the North African campaign that were housed at Old Fort Niagara. They brought them here by bus. One of the reasons they brought them here is that Mr. Greenwald was the farm manager at that time for Mr. McClew, and he spoke German. He was German and could correspond, could speak to the German prisoners of war. So they brought these German prisoners of war here by bus, and they all piled out of the bus, and the guard said to Mr. Greenwald, "Mr. Greenwald, get your 3 teenage daughters out of here. Get them in the house, bar the doors, close the windows, get them away from these prisoners," implying that these were very desperate prisoners of war. No, these were very desperate young ladies. These were the only guys in town in 1945, and they were looking better all the time. So sure enough, the 3 young ladies ran up to the attic of the house, got their Brownie flash camera, which was totally forbidden for security reasons, leaned out the window and said, "Hi guys," and took photographs, from which we have the only known photograph of German prisoners of war out working in Niagara County, because it was, for security reasons, forbidden. It's a horrible photograph. You can't tell the leaves on the trees from the prisoners of war, but what do you expect from 3 novices hanging out a window? And they have that hanging outside in the barn. So that's a little bit of an overview of our history. The Underground Railroad is, as
Let me go back and ask the question. You said your father was an attaché?
Military attaché.
So you and your sister were in Israel in 1949?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's a remarkable story in and of itself.
Yeah. It was a remarkable experience. But, you know, it's all serendipity because when I came here, not only did I know nothing about the Underground Railroad, but neither did anybody else, and nobody cared. And even after I started talking to people about the fact that the McClews were involved, it was what I call throwaway history. People would say, "Oh, do you see ghosts?" Or, it was just totally unimportant history. But because it struck that responsive chord in me, I started researching it. I was a generation too late, you know, the generation of people that could have documented this, that knew the story, were gone. And I was getting like secondhand information, but at least I got that. By the time the National Park Service got involved and generated all this excitement about the Underground Railroad, which was 15, 20 years after I had purchased the property, that generation that I had talked to was gone. So that the information was more and more diluted. So I was really fortunate to get an interest in it when there were still a couple of people around that had memories.
Right, and I interrupted you because
okay.
I thought that was a really interesting point of your life that connected you to.
Right. Well, you know, and I think it's significant that when I say for some bizarre reason, my father was a pretty staunch Presbyterian, and I don't know why in the world they appointed a staunch Presbyterian, and he was very young to be the military attaché to Israel. It was an extremely volatile area and very important diplomatically. My sister and I talk about this frequently, that what was going on? Why my father? Why was he appointed to this position? And I think that's significant because you would sort of assume that in that position they would have chosen somebody that was Jewish. And if you are Jewish, you understand this history right away. It's the same history. So, you know, if you're brought up in a Jewish family, you don't have to be told about the significance of the Underground Railroad. But we weren't. So it was all learned from being exposed to these people who had just come through a catastrophe.
Right.
So it was pretty profound. So I started researching the history of the McClew family, even though I was discouraged by the town historian. I plugged away and kept researching their history. I had read all the books over in Newfane. Doesn't say anything anywhere about the Underground Railroad, even though this area is thought to have been where the pathway came through going to Niagara Falls. Again, I think it's, as I say, throwaway history, even more so when it was happening than 20, 50, 100 years after it happened. People just did not write things down, and you sort of have to read between the lines. One of the things I did, I had a job working for a newspaper at that time, Local Interest, and I went around and interviewed citizens in Newfane to find local color. And I interviewed the woman who was in her 90s at the time, who had owned and operated the Burt Hotel. And the Burt Hotel was right on the railroad tracks from the New York Central Railroad, and had been not only well, it was a hotel. It was a restaurant and a hotel, and it was a stop for the railroad, so they got people stopping in there. That's what that hotel was built for. So I interviewed her, and it was really about her life as a hotel owner and her experiences. In the process of this conversation, she said to me, "So where do you live?" And I told her where I lived, and she said, "Oh, that's where they hid those colored people," which I thought was extremely important, because this is one of those people who was old enough to have first-hand information. She was also potentially at a place where this history passed through. And today that would be a very wonderful thing to say, this was part of the Underground Railroad. In her case, she thought it was not something to be proud of and said it in a very derogatory way. And I think that raised more flags for me than anything anybody could have said. I do have her name, and I think the article I wrote about her, which does not mention that part of it, so I could come up with her name, but I don't know it off the top of my head. I also interviewed Clifford Schrader and had intended to videotape him and write. He had such wonderful stories. He was in his 90s. He lived right across from me, sort of, on West Creek Road. Unfortunately, he died the week before we were supposed to do our videotaping. But he told me lovely stories, and one of the things he told me was that right where he lives on West Creek Road, which is south of where this property is, there's a crossing place over 18 Mile Creek. His property was right on 18 Mile Creek. And he said there was the old Indian crossing right there. And so with the Underground Railroad, first of all, 18 Mile Creek was thought to have been a pretty active trail. And if you're coming from Barker, that's where you would go across. You would cross over right there. And the Underground Railroad gets all tied up with Native American Indian settlements anyway. I cannot give you any specifics about this area, but Mr. Schrader, when I talked to him, felt that that was probably where people trying to escape from slavery had crossed over to get over west to go towards the Niagara River. I forgot to mention too that I had been told that there was still visual remains of Native American settlements along Hopkins Creek when I moved in here. Unfortunately, right after I moved in here, the town of Newfane decided it would be prudent to dredge Hopkins Creek and wiped out everything that was down there with bulldozers, so it's gone. But there were pretty recent Native American settlement remains up there on Hopkins Creek. So that was Mr. Schrader's contribution to my little bit of facts, that he felt that had been. And again, Mr. Schrader was 90 years old, and nobody cared about the Underground Railroad, and the fact that he knew about it and said that this is where people crossed, I felt was very significant, because it's not something that he studied in school or people talked about. This is a memory of his from either his memory, I would guess that would have made his parents telling him, but it's pretty close to the bone information that people were coming through this way.
Okay, we're good.
Okay. I think even today, as sophisticated as we have become about the Underground Railroad, if you say a property has a link to the Underground Railroad, that people that lived on this property were involved in the Underground Railroad, the first thing people ask you is, where's the hiding place, or where's the tunnel, or and unfortunately this history has been convoluted so that today, when it's a good thing to be involved or connected to the Underground Railroad, every time somebody opens an attic door and discovers a little cubby hole or any kind of elusive room, they start shouting Underground Railroad and thinking they can work backwards from a secret hiding place to the history, which is of course absolutely wrong. I always explain it as again referring to World War II, that if you were sitting in your kitchen in Berlin in 1939 and somebody came and rapped on your door and said, "Help, I'm Jewish, the Gestapo's after me, will you help me?" If you are so inclined, probably the last thing you're going to say is, "Well, okay, but you've got to stay outside there for a couple hours while I build you a secret hiding place and start pounding." And you just use whatever presents itself, whatever is available. And you can see how remote we are here today. We were even more remote in 1850. So the idea that anybody would go around building secret hiding places, I think, is pretty remote. We do have the required underground hiding place here. Well, it doesn't have to be underground, but we do have a concealed room in the barn. We have had an archaeological study conducted there. The archaeologists were pretty convinced that there were people hiding down in that room. I would be positively astounded to find out that that room was built for the purpose of the Underground Railroad. I think the room was existing. I think the room was either a cistern built to hold well water, cistern from the downspouts, built to hold water, or it could have been built by the McClews as a hiding place for themselves. During the War of 1812, and there were skirmishes fought here on this property, everybody built secret hiding places for themselves. So if the British and marauding Native Americans came, they would have a place to disappear. Most of them were not connected to a building. Most of these hiding places were out in the middle of a cornfield or out in the middle of the woods, but constructed exactly like this room in our barn. So I would surmise that this room was pre-existing, and if it were in fact used as a hiding place for people escaping slavery, it was because it was such a slick hiding place to begin with. I can't imagine that they built it for that purpose. There just wouldn't be any need. And it's funny, there's another property, the Thomas Root House, which is a pretty well documented Underground Railroad site in Capen. And the people that live there are very gracious about letting scholars and people walk through their house, although it's their private residence and it's not open to the public. But if you go there for a tour, they will dutifully take you down to the root cellar, where it's dark and dank and smells like dirt, and everybody goes, "Oh, here's a secret hiding place." The truth of the matter is, documented by Thomas Root's children after the fact, is that when people came there trying to escape from slavery, they were given a guest room in the house, and the children would come down for breakfast in the morning, and there would be strange new faces at the table, and they were taught to say, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am," and mind their own business, which I think is a much more charming story than a dank, dark hiding place. But people expect that today. That's what they want. And I think that's been a problem. I know the National Park Service has written about that you can't, the public is so enchanted with that idea that you don't want to dismiss it. You don't want to say, "Oh, that's all bunk," although it probably is bunk, but it's such an enchanting premise and brings people into the mystery of this history that you have to walk a fine line, I think, of what's real and what's fantasy. But we do have a room out in the barn, a concealed room, which certainly visually tells the story of the Underground Railroad. We have had an archaeological study done. We have not received a report ever from the archaeologist, which is just a tragedy. We have threatened them with lawsuits. We have done everything we can, and we're not going to get a report from them. While they were here, they also did a study of local churches to try and find out which churches were abolitionist churches. And there were many churches in this area that were abolitionist churches. One of the archaeologists that was that was heading up this field study had a whole report on these abolitionist churches in the area, one of them being the Methodist Church in Olcott, which the McClew family donated the land for, and it was an abolitionist church. We've never gotten his report, and I don't know where he got that information from. I called the Methodist Church in Olcott and asked them if they had records and if it had been an abolitionist church, and she said, I don't have a clue, all the records burned up a few years ago. So I don't know if Jerry got his information elsewhere. I suspect he did, or if he got the information before the records burned up, but somewhere out there are records. The Baptist church here in Newfane was an abolitionist church. That was researched by Mr. Dickerson, the historian in Newfane, and he found a tremendous amount of information about that. And they had to have a resolution voted on by the congregation to become an abolitionist church. So there are records out there, and if somebody would research that, they could find out about the Methodist Church in Olcott. But I don't have that research. The barn. The barn is where people were thought to come in and stay. Of course, that's where the concealed room is. We have had the barn dated a couple of different ways. The assessor's records in the town of Newfane put it at 1850, and we've had the barn guru from New York State come and look at the barn, and it's a very fascinating architectural barn. Because how they date barns is by the internal structure, and prior to 1850 they had what they called an H construction, where the beams looked like a letter H and the roof fit over the top of that. And of course the whole purpose of these gambrel roof barns like ours was to store the hay up on top. So by 1860 they discovered that these beams sticking up were just a big nuisance when you were trying to haul hay up to the barn. They were in the way. So by 1860, they had invented this skeleton that's sort of like an exoskeleton that mirrors the shape of the roof, so that the whole area was open and free and unencumbered by beams. So you can date barns pretty precisely by whether or not they have this H construction. And the other thing you can date them by is by circular saws, because circular saws were not introduced until about 1870 in common use. So if your rafters had been cut by a circular saw, which is very evident when you look at the rafters, that puts it at about 1870. So when the barn guru came and looked at our barn, he was totally mystified, because it is a flat-out classic letter H construction barn from like the 1840s with circular saw rafters. And he said, this is all wrong. And what they finally decided is that North Tonawanda was such a huge lumber district that they had circular saws way before anybody else. And apparently, 10 years before they came into common practice, the McClews went and had their rafters all cut with a circular saw. And that's why our barn is totally undateable by most standards. We also have an icehouse on the property and a smokehouse on the property dating from that era. So, the McClew family. We know a lot more about some of the brothers and sisters than we do about Charles McClew. But Charles McClew is the brother that came and moved his family to this particular site. He only had one child, Herbert McClew, and that's why the farm fell out of the McClew family. Herbert had one child. I beg your pardon, Charles had more than one child, but Herbert inherited the farm. Herbert only had one child, a daughter who married a doctor and moved to Florida, so there was nobody to take over the farm. On top of which, Herbert sort of went bankrupt during the Depression, He owned Newfane Fuel as well as the farm. Two stories. The one story is that he extended so much credit during the Depression to people for fuel that he went under. And the other story, according to Clifford Schrader, my 90-year-old neighbor, was he said, all these guys are trying so hard to outdo each other with the big fancy houses and the big fancy ways of living that they all went under. So I don't know which story is true. But Mr. Schrader was a crotchety old guy, but he tended to tell the truth. So Charles lived here. He had all these siblings. He had a sister, Nancy, who much younger. She was the youngest of the McClew children. We have very well documented information on Nancy McClew, who it turns out was a big rabble-rouser for the women's rights movement. And in 1984, she was a big supporter of the Belva Lockwood for President campaign, to the point where she went down in the 1984 election and tried to vote for Belva Lockwood. I knew it wasn't until relatively recently that the gentlemen were kind enough to give us ladies the right to vote, but I really didn't know it was a criminal offense to try, and it was. In fact, Susan B. Anthony was arrested for trying to vote in an earlier election. Nancy McClew was a little bit swifter on her feet. When she went down to vote in the 1884 election, the governor of New York State issued a warrant for her arrest. She skipped town before they could arrest her. She left and went to Indiana and lived with her two brothers in Indiana until the heat cooled off and the warrant was lifted and she could come back again. As a result of that history, we found out that these two brothers that lived in Indiana, Robert and John, are also believed to have been part of the Underground Railroad in Steuben County, Indiana. We never knew that because the McClews had this consistent habit of changing their name. They arrived in this country with the name McClumpha from Scotland. Their name was McClumpha. I guess assuming that this was not an appropriate name for new American immigrants, they changed it to McClumphy, infinitely more suitable. And then it morphed into McClew when they moved into this area, and it was spelled two different ways. So in the town of Newfane, you see the names McClumpha, McClumphy, McClew spelled C-L-E-W, and McClew spelled C-L-U-E. It's all the same family, and there are even some McClures, C-L-U-R-E, thrown into this mix. So it's really a challenge to research them. When the two brothers went to Indiana, their spelling of their name was C-L-U-E. So we never connected it, and the people in Steuben County had been researching their involvement in the Underground Railroad, which is very interesting, for years before we finally hooked up. These two brothers went to Indiana and they married sisters. And the father of these sisters, Mr. Farnham, was a very well-known Underground Railroad conductor. And as a little silly sidelight, they have in their histories of the Farnham family a picture of Mr. Farnham's house, and it's almost the exact replica of this house. I don't know what significance that has, but it looks just like this house. And they have, I've gotten some information. There is lots of information out there about John and Robert's involvement. I just haven't pulled it all together. I have bits and pieces of it scattered all over the place. Another, I think, really interesting thing in the story of Nancy McClew is that one of the children said, well, I guess the daughter was arrested with her at the same time, or went to vote at the same time. And someone said to her, well, what were you going to do if they arrested you? And she said, well, we were going to sit in the jail cell, and we were going to hold hands, and we were going to sing songs until they let us out. And the author of this history said, And if they sang like the rest of the McClews, they would have let them out instantly. And I think that's interesting because that was a pretty common ploy during the civil rights movement, and I guess it had come down through the generations. Another interesting thing about the McClew family is that throughout this whole history, it is the women who seem to take a dominant role, with David McClew, Charles's father. In one of the histories it says, David was not much of a man, did a lot of drinking, did a lot of sitting around, but his wife was a formidable woman. And when you read about the formation of the Farmers Club, which turned into the Farm Bureau, it was founded by Mr. Brown, Mr. Jones, Mr. Smith, Mr. and Mrs. McClew. Her name just pops up where it has no business popping up back in that era. I think the women in the McClew family, in addition to Nancy McClew, were always the strength of the family. When I moved here 36 years ago, there was one McClew that I know of left in this area. That was Malcolm McClew, who has only recently passed away. He's the person that originally set me on my quest. I sought him out and sat down with him to have him tell me what he knew about the McClew family, which wasn't a whole lot, but one of the things he told me that I thought was interesting was that when he was in World War II, he was stationed in the Solomon Islands, and he was so appalled by the way that the U.S. Defense Forces treated the natives of the Solomon Islands that he wrote a letter of protest to the Department of Defense about how we should not treat people this way. So I guess this moral streak of humanitarianism came down pretty strongly. He was a remarkably nice man. All the McClews I have met to date have been remarkably nice and decent people. It's a very commendable family. What can I tell you about Charles McClew? Very active in local politics. They donated the land for the Methodist Church in Alcott. They donated a big log for the log cabin that was up in Crow Park, which I think they've moved now. It's on Lockport Alcott Road, almost into, or right in Alcott. Donated the biggest log. They were involved in what became the Farmers Club of New York State, which then became the Farm Bureau. They were, throughout all this, all the McClews were innovative, very good farmers, and were responsible for agriculture becoming such a strong industry in Niagara County. They brought Cornell Cooperative Extension into this area to teach farmers new and innovative practices, and this farm was built on Alberta peaches, which were hard to grow, and they were just really good farmers. I have to read between the lines here. There's no mention anywhere in his document, though it was written in the 1940s, about the Underground Railroad. However, his specialty, Newell Sims, was, I forget what they called it. He taught at Oberlin College, and he was recognized as a pioneer in American sociology, and it was sociology, social change, and race relations, like back in the 1940s. Never says anything about, Underground Railroad helping people escape from slavery, but he might. He has all kinds of works written, which I've never researched. They're out in Oberlin College. He taught at Amherst College. He taught at Smith College. He's all over the place. So he has all kinds of things written that ought to be researched. There might be some documentation in there about the family's involvement in the Underground Railroad. If it's going to be found anywhere, it's going to be found with Newell Sims, and I just have not been able to document that. I had a graduate student last year who came and helped me for a couple of weeks, and he would sit here with his iPhone and do research and pulled out things that had taken me, 15 years of research, going to libraries and going through old tomes, and he found them instantly. I don't know how he did it. I've tried to do that and I just get lost in this muddle of words, but he was so good at it. So somebody needs to do that. Somebody needs to document or research Newell Sims and everything he wrote down. He I'm sure, there's anything written. Unfortunately, this house was pirated. The people that lived here, two owners before I bought it, absolutely pirated the house. They removed things that should never ever have been removed, sold them, destroyed them. They just really raped the property. So if there was anything left of significance, any artifacts, they got them. And then on top of that, the house burned right after I bought it. And I can remember standing outside as they were what should I say, after the fire, they had to go and make it safe. So they were knocking down burned beams, and as they were doing that up in the attic, papers were fluttering down from the attic eaves, and I have no idea what kind of papers were fluttering down, and they just are gone. So we never got to, I have no idea what might have been included in those papers. The people that lived here that pirated the property, there's another one of those enticing little things, is that they moved out of the property because they were so terrified of the ghost. These were very well educated. She was a professor at Buff State. He worked in construction, which was what you saw all throughout this house, was pirated parts from other construction sites. But anyway, they tried to turn this house into a 1950 ranch house with suspended acoustical tile ceilings and shag rugs, and they were absolutely terrified of the ghost and moved out. If I'd been the ghost, I would have been annoyed too with them doing such terrible things to my house. But the story of the ghost, and I just ran across a letter from, their name was Johnson, and I just ran across a letter which I need to pursue, because I was told, and it's just in my head, that the ghost, his name was Henry, and he was a man who was trying to escape from slavery. He got as far as the McClew house, and he had been traveling with a woman, and the woman he was traveling with got separated from him. They got separated somehow. So he stayed here waiting for her to catch up, and she never did. So he's still here waiting for her. That is the ghost story. What's interesting is I just found this letter from Mr. Johnson to somebody here in Newfane. Or it was a letter from somebody here in Newfane to Mr. Johnson that said, "Thank you so much for sharing the story of Henry with me." And there was more to it than that. I have to find this person and find out the conversation between them so that I have something besides my memories to document this story of Henry the ghost, who was sitting here waiting for his companion.
We have just about 10 minutes. So if you want to start something.
I had another story with the ghost, and it went out of my head.
So the ghost, there's only one ghost story.
No, there are other ghost stories, but
the
that's
Henry is the one that is the most recorded?
It's the one that's the most recorded. He's the one that had the involvement with the Underground Railroad.
Mm-hmm.
I had somebody come here, also a very well-educated and accomplished woman who was a big believer in ghosts, and she went upstairs and sat for an hour with a legal pad and communed with the ghosts and filled pages of information and told me, but his name was John. And she described what he looked like and what he was wearing, and John thought I was just swell and he was going to look after me and protect me, and he wanted me to stay here, but there was no connection with the Underground Railroad. Although it was a nice story, I liked it, but it had no historic significance. So I didn't think there's no old house that doesn't have ghost stories connected to it. I'm not a believer. I don't believe in ghosts, but I think when you get a story like the one with Henry, where it's somebody escaping slavery, it's significant because there had to be some fact that generated a story like that. Mm-hmm. There had to be some connection, I think, with the Underground Railroad. In that time and age when nobody cared, there had to be a connection, or the story would have never gained a foothold. It would have never happened.
So have you had any contact with the owners who pirated the house other than that letter?
Lots of contact.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, well, they were the ones that came here and pirated the house and had the Henry story. Then they sold it to the Kaltwassers. And here's another one of those elusive things that the Kaltwassers had a team of scholars from UB come out here because of the history of the Underground Railroad. And like everybody does, they dutifully went around and inspected all the buildings looking for secret hiding places, and apparently what they were most interested in was a building that was sitting out, which is now my North Orchard, which has since been torn down. It was torn down before I moved here. I don't know why they thought that one building was of any particular significance, but they came out here because of their interest in the Underground Railroad. That's all I know.
But no reports?
No report. That was in the early 1970s that they would have been here. No report.
Well, this certainly has been a journey for you of research that is,
I think,
you always feel like you probably are going around the corner and it's got to be all right there.
Yes.
And it leads the trail on another journey.
Yes. I feel it's like these little concentric circles, and I've never gotten to the smoking gun, but I've never found anything that disproves all the rumors and folklore, and anything that we have found, like John and Robert being involved in the Underground Railroad, certainly make it not only feasible but very likely.
Right.
Never found a smoking gun. I'm not convinced it isn't out there.
And you've been very dedicated to this and to sharing this with the public. And how about one more question for today? What gave you an interest in farming?
Nothing.
No interest in farming?
No.
You had an entire interest in the house.
I wanted to have a horse. And actually when we came looking for a farm, this place next door was up for sale, which is a horse farm. So the realtor brought us out here to look at the horse farm. And while I was looking at this horse farm, I was looking out the window, whoa, what's that house over there? And they said, well, that's for sale too, but it's not a farm, it doesn't have any land to it, it only has 5 acres. So it turned out that these 2 properties were for sale, so we ended up buying this house and then 65 acres that was connected to the horse farm, because they didn't really want the 65 acres, and the 65 acres had been a part of this farm, and everybody that had lived here after Herbert McClew had sold off
Right,
a little bit
something.
more of the property. So I bought back, I think it was up to 300 acres at one time, this farm, so there's still a lot more out there. And it had been my intention when I bought the property, as soon as anything came up for sale, I was going to buy it and put it back together again. But then fires and divorces and things like that got in the way, so I never did that. But I got the 65 acres from the horse farm and this and put it back together as a farm. And then when you have a bunch of orchards that are producing, you'd best learn fast, because they're not going to wait for you. So apples need picked.
So
I
what
just sort of
what
fell
year
into
did
it.
you purchase the property again?
1979.
Okay.
And it's treated me well. It's been, I'm not a good farmer. It takes a lot of expertise, it takes a lot of experience to be a good farmer. I'm not a good farmer, but I am the world's biggest cheerleader for good farmers. I think they're absolutely remarkable people. I'm so impressed with the old family farmers that I have met here. They're just not only very, very smart, very, very experienced. I mean, there are people of the soil. They live with the earth. They understand life. And they're also very wise. I think that comes from hours sitting on a tractor with nothing to do except look around and think. And there's just an incredible amount of wisdom. And I think that's one of the biggest tragedies of losing our family farms, is that we're losing that homespun wisdom and that connection with the earth. That it's invaluable. I'm just so impressed with. And I don't know if any farmer, everybody thinks of farmers sitting on their back steps chewing on a piece of straw, and I guess there are the Bud Platts of the world that fit that description. But all these orchardists that I know are all college graduates, and they're all very well educated. They all walk around in rags, pretty much, you know, and they don't care. They just love the life they're living, and they're just wise and wonderful, and we will miss them sorely when they're gone, and they're going to be gone.
So that is it. It just got